Right, thanks for watching. We're going to be continuing with our study of Ruth. We're looking at Ruth chapter 1, finishing chapter 1 out with verses 15 through 22. Um, as we get into this, just kind of remember we've set the stage. Naomi is from Judah, from Bethlehem in Judah. She has gone to Moab, a foreign country, and spent 10 years there. Um, while there, her husband died and two sons died. She's returning, and her two daughter-in-laws are coming with her. Remember, she was initially there for a famine, and they've heard that the famine is over. Um, so as they go, we just left where Orpah, one of her daughter-in-laws, has returned to go back to Moab, but Ruth is going to be clings to her. She's insistent she's going to stay, and so most of what we're looking at here is Ruth's conversation with Naomi about wanting to stay with her and being committed to her, and just kind of help us kind of get into the mindset of ancient world. Keep in mind, extended families has been the norm for most people, and most times. Our current, past 100 years or so, is fairly rare. I've just been reading an article in the Atlantic. I believe it was David Brooks, about the nuclear family, and how much of an aberration that is. Um, anyway, so the idea was that with an extended family, that's your insurance. That's your broad support group. If there's trouble, you have others to rely on, and that kind of highlights the tragic nature of this. To be a widow, older, foreigner, all of these very vulnerable because there's the expectation of large extended families to care for, and so here we see kind of a relationship we might not expect, where a daughter-in-law with no obligation is going to commit herself to stay with her mother-in-law, even after her husband has died, and they're both widows, both in difficult situations. So we're gonna turn the text, gonna read through it, gonna just point out a few things to you, and then um, make a few points. So we're starting with Ruth, chapter 1, verse 15. And she said, this is Naomi speaking, and she said, "See, your sister in law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister in law." But Ruth said, "Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me and more also, if anything but death parts me from you." And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. So the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" And she said to them, "Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi, when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab. And they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. Uh, all right, so let me just kind of walk back through this and point out a few things. So she's reminding her sister-in-law has gone back and to her people and her gods. So the idea is she's gone back to everything that identifies her. Um, the ancient world, there were different things that really were strongly part of who you were. They're your identity. One is the land in which you live. You're there. This is the land of your people. Her people, so her ethnic group. the group who spoke her language, and the other was religion, the gods they worshipped. And most of the ancient world kind of had this view that there were many gods, and there were maybe a god who had particular strength in a certain area. The Moabite god was Chemosh, and he's kind of referred to by that name in other places. So um, the idea is that the Orpah is going back to her people, going back to the land she's familiar with. She's going back to her family, her cultural ties, and also her religion. She's going back to that worship. And Ruth, I mean Naomi is encouraging Ruth to do the same. And Ruth tells her to stop it. Don't urge me to leave or return from following you. And this is when she gives that beautiful speech, very appropriate at weddings, very poetic and very touching. Um, where you go, I will go. So she's going to go to this place. Where you lodge, I will lodge. I'm going to stay in this place with you. So this is, I'm choosing to make your land my land. Your people will be my people. So this isn't just family, but now Ruth is choosing to now identify herself with the Hebrews, her people. Naomi's people are now going to be Ruth's people. And so she's going to adopt the culture, going to adopt the ways, and she's going to convert. She's going to adopt the faith. Your God, my God. So she's completely transferring her allegiance now from being a Moabite and to now going with Naomi and becoming part of this culture, and that includes now following the God of Israel. And so now this allegiance is going to be strong. Verse 17, where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. So, in other words, she's saying, I'm going to go, and it's going to be so definite, so full of a transfer that it's not even going to be that I'm going to go and stay with you, and when you die, then that's going to set me free, and I'm going to return to Moab. Um, she's saying that this is her full conviction, that even after death, the plan will be that she is going to continue to be there, even to the point of being buried where she is, buried in this land. That she's not no longer, she's cutting off all ties with Moab. Perhaps you remember some of the other biblical stories where it was important for someone to be buried a certain place. That uh, you might remember the story of Jacob um, and Joseph, and Jacob dies in Israel. I'm sorry, Jacob dies in Egypt, but part of the promise is that his body is going to be taken and he's going to be buried in the promised land. So here we see, and that is that you die and you rest with your ancestors. Biblical phrase is sleep with your fathers, and so here's the idea that she is saying, I'm even cutting off there. I'm now going to be buried where you're buried. And may the Lord do so to me and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. And so again, we'll notice the Lord there. She's not referring to a generic God. She's now calling on the God of Israel in her oath. That's this part of her complete transfer and conversion is that she's even in her making a vow, even in calling a curse on her if she doesn't keep this, she's calling on the God of Israel by name. So Naomi realizes she's committed to this, and she doesn't say anything else. And so now we skip the travel, and they return to Bethlehem. And when they come in, the whole town is stirred up. So this is a so rural agricultural community. It's not a walled city. It's a farming town, and the whole town is excited and stirred up. And they're saying, "Is this Naomi?" If you can imagine the idea of somebody leaving and then 10 years later showing back up, and that would be the talk of the town. So they're discussing this. And as they do so, Naomi says, Naomi, which means pleasant or sweet, don't call me this, call me Mara, call me bitter, for the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me. And again, she's looking at her situation that she went away full, and the Lord's brought her back empty. Now, she had all these things, and now she has nothing. And she even says that God has testified against me, and that's the idea of even saying God has brought judgment on me and brought calamity against me. And so she properly recognizes God's hand in everything, but she's not aware of what God is doing, of God's blessing even in the difficulty. And so they return, and in verse 22, that Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law. So it's interesting that the narrator wants to point out that Ruth is foreign. She was Moabite, but interestingly that she returned from the country of Moab, um, and there um, is an unusual thing because she didn't really return. Uh, Ruth had never been in Bethlehem. And so the use of this word is interesting because it's kind of pointing out that this foreigner, this Gentile, has now made Bethlehem her home. She has identified so that there's this sense of as she's adopted this home, she's now returned to this home, that she's now where she said she's going to belong. And the timing is now in the barley harvest. Narrator points out this, and this, time wise, is going to be late April, early May. The barley harvest comes, and then a little later the wheat harvest, and so we're kind of told when this takes place. But the narrator does this. In part, it sets up the next phase of the story, where Ruth will be picking up leftover grain in the fields after the harvesters come through. So, an interesting detail there, but it's also a beautiful, subtle way of giving us hope. It's time for a harvest. Um, so, a few things here. So, the first thing I want to look at is that how Ruth is a foreigner. She's a Gentile. She's not part of God's people, but God is bringing her in. Some of our ancestors in the faith saw in Ruth a picture of the fulfillment of God's promise of bringing the Gentiles into his family. We saw how Abraham is blessed to be a blessing on all nations, and throughout the Old Testament, it's prophecies of all the nations, the Gentiles coming to worship God, coming to submit to the God of Israel. And ultimately, we see in Jesus the fulfillment of Israel. We see the church extending to the Gentiles, to the nations, and through Christ coming to God. And so Ruth pictures that for us. She is a convert, and the commentators kind of go back and forth. It's not really told a lot about how much she understands and what she knows, and the inner workings of her heart. And some of us might be used to powerful emotional um, changes in our life that are part of conversion. What we see in Ruth is she commits herself to what she does know. She commits herself to Naomi's God. She certainly would know some about that, and if there's the sense in which she operates on what information she has and commits herself to it. Um, and so we see this idea of the Gentile becoming part of God's people, and God drawing them to Himself. So it's interesting that there be this idea that now she has returned. I think there's a sense in which all of us coming to God, uh, that we return to Him. He is our true home. Um, we've might have we've been estranged as sinners away from Him. We were not a people, and He's made us a people. We have been in rebellion against Him, but there's a sense in which because He is who we are truly made to be in communion with. to come to him, to become part of his family, to enter into the church is very much a return. It's a homecoming um, anytime we do that. And so wanted to also point out one other thing with this, and that's the way Naomi is looking at things, and how the narrator contrasts that with the hope we see in the harvest. Naomi sees her bitterness. She went away empty. She went away full and has come back empty. God has been against her, and certainly she's been through tragedy, difficult situation. She's suffered incredible loss and grief, and she is suffering bitterness. But in that bitterness, she seems blind to what God is doing and what we, following this story, are beginning to pick up on. For one thing, is in Ruth, she has a wonderful companion, an incredible blessing of God, um, someone who's going to come and stick with her, knowing she's in a difficult situation, but committing herself completely. In that sense, Ruth pictures for us God. Um, she shows to us his unending covenant that he's going to be with us where we go. He's going to identify with us so completely as Jesus comes to us in the incarnation, and that nothing will ever separate us from him. And so Ruth kind of shows that covenant love that we know God has for us. And in her grief, in her sadness, in her darkness, even as she returns to long lost friends, and there should be rejoicing, she fails to recognize this incredible blessing and fails to see the goodness that's going. And she fails to see that God has ended the famine. He has visited his people and he's bringing them bread. He's bringing them what they need. And this just quick phrase that tells us God is going to do something, that they come about the time of the barley harvest. Um, you know, the harvest is a wonderful time. It's a time of celebration because for months, work has gone unseen. There was work that was done in planting and plowing and fertilizing and getting the fields ready. That now is, that's done, and that's something you don't see the immediate reward for. The seed does its work over time underground. You don't see it, and there can be anxious expectation as to whether going to be appropriate for a good crop. Is there going to be enough? Um, and so for months is kind of slowly watching things develop and watching things grow. The harvest is when you reap the rewards, you get the fruit of your work that was done earlier, and you get what has been working for a time hidden. And I think not only um, it points us to the way God works in our lives. Um, Naomi is not seeing God's work. She's not seeing how, for the years, God is working out a plan to bring her into contact with Ruth and have them come back, and how this is all part of God's plan, and and bring her at the right time to where she's gonna, we'll see, meet Boaz and do these things. There's a sense in which she's blind to that operation, that work, and um, yet we know a harvest eventually comes. And so just want to kind of say that, when we can be down and dejected, we can be sad at times. We can look around and wonder, has God forgotten us? Is anything I'm doing worthwhile? We're not seeing immediate results from things we're praying for, and study we're doing and efforts we're making in relationships. And here is this hope that a harvest does come. Um, God is at work in everything. His word will never be empty. Whatever he's doing in our life is not in vain. It's for our good, and there will be a harvest. There will be a reward. And maybe especially now, as we can be tempted to times of sadness and despair and wonder what's God doing, is the promise he is at work, and there will be a harvest. Well, I hope this is helpful. Look forward to next week. We'll get into chapter 2. Thank you. Take care.